And again, the king serves under Yahweh's rule as his viceroy, and the only thing the king has to do, the only duty, is to lead Israel in covenant faithfulness. The only thing. We had seen in a couple of passages last class how in Deuteronomy the king wasn't supposed to take a bunch of horses for himself, wasn't supposed to take a bunch of foreign wives for himself, wasn't even meant to be a foreigner. Again, it's supposed to be from the way that some translations will render it, and it's probably best to put it that it's that the king was meant to be one of the brothers from Israel. So again, that inherent to the kingship is the fact that it's not somebody to rule over them. It's not some CEO person. It's not a CFO. But it's somebody from among them who shares in this role and who's chosen by God for a specific purpose of ruling under Yahweh. And again, when we talk about ruling, a lot of it has to do more with responsibility than it does with dominating. That ruling has much more to do with responsibility than it does with domineering. And so when we get to 2 Samuel 7, what we're going to start seeing are some of the promises made by Yahweh. So I will bring this up and then we'll talk about it. If you guys want to go ahead, pull up 2 Samuel 7 on your laptops. Pull it up on your devices. If you have a Bible right there nearby, flip the pages over to 2 Samuel 7. And so a few things that I do want you to keep in mind is to keep in mind what is the covenant, that what are the promises made by Yahweh and what is being demanded. And this thing probably should be what expectations involved. And what other covenants does it sound like? What other covenants does it recall? So let's go ahead and read through this. Oh, there we go. NRSV. So now when the king was settled in his house and the Lord had given him rest from his enemies around him, the king said to the prophet Nathan, "See, I am living in a house of cedar, but the ark of God stays in a tent." So Nathan said to the king, "Go and do all that you have in mind, for the Lord is with you." So David wants to build God a house. He sees that he himself is living in a better house than Yahweh. So he's okay, let me build him something nice and pretty. So verse 4, but that same night the word of the Lord came to Nathan, "Go and tell my servant David, thus says the Lord, are you the one to build me a house to live in? I have not lived in a house since the day I brought up the people of Israel from Egypt to this day, but I have been moving about in a tent and a tabernacle. Wherever I have moved about among all the people of Israel, did I ever speak a word with any of the tribal leaders of Israel, whom I commanded to shepherd my people Israel, saying, why have you not built me a house of cedar?" Again, God's never asked for a home up to this point. What you would have in the ancient Near East, and you guys will know this from your cultures classes, that usually you would build a house for the deity to dwell in. Again, mostly out of necessity, that the deity needed a house to dwell in, but again, not with this God. So in verse 8, that now therefore thus you shall say to my servant David, thus says the Lord of hosts, I took you from the pasture following the sheep to be prince over my people Israel, and I've been with you wherever you went, and I've cut off all your enemies from before you, and I will make for you a great name. Pay attention to those I wills as we read through this, because you'll see over and again, you'll see I will, I will, I will, and that'll kind of clue you in on what Davidic covenant is. So I will make for you a great name, like the name of the great ones of the earth. And I will appoint a place for my people Israel, and will plant them so that they may live in their own place and be disturbed no more. And evildoers shall afflict them no more as formerly, from the time that I appointed judges over my people Israel. And I will give you rest from all your enemies. Moreover, the Lord declares to you that the Lord will make you a house. The Lord will make you a house. You should note some of the irony going on there, or how the turntables. There you go. And that, anybody know what that's from? Yeah. There you go. How the turntables. So random, but we'll jump back into it. So yeah, the tables are starting to turn a little bit because what Yahweh is doing is again playing off this word house, and that note who wants to make a house and who is getting turned into a house, and we'll come back to that. Verse 12. For those who are wondering, it's right here. That when your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come forth from your own body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be a father to him, and he shall be a son to me. When he commits iniquity, I will punish him with a rod such as mortals use, with blows inflicted by human beings. But I will not take my steadfast love from him, as I took it from Saul, whom I put away from before you. Your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever. Your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever. In accordance with all these words and with all this vision, Nathan spoke to David. And so let me go ahead and go back to our PowerPoint here. So what are some of the promises that are being made? What are some of the promises that are being made? I'll go back to the text here so you guys can take a look.
The Lord's going to look after his son.
Mm-hmm. But who's being described as a son?
It'll be whoever, or when David fathers it, when David has a kid.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but what role is the son in?
Is it the Syrian like that type of covenant?
Not necessarily, because there's again, this is where it starts to take a little bit of a turn when you have this mention of I will be a father to him and he shall be a son to me. That it starts to take a little bit of that turn. So it's good that you had brought it up, Jake, because this is one of the expectations that comes out, and with one of the titles we see for a king come up, and that's Son of God. That the name Son of God is a way of saying in the ancient Near East for a king. And then we say king, again, the connotation is Son of God. That at this point, there's no assumption of deity. There's no assumption that this person is God in the flesh. Again, that's more common to Egypt, and it's more common to pagan, another pagan nation, or I don't want to say pagan nations, but of other surrounding ancient Near Eastern nations, where to be, again, to be a king or to be a queen would mean some kind of stature of divinity. But at this point, what it means is that, again, the relationship between the king and Yahweh is between a father and a son. And so when we get, again, keep this in mind, especially when we get to the New Testament and you read through passages like, this is my son in whom I'm well pleased. Because again, the connotation for Jesus being Son of God, in some places has allusions to divinity, but more often than not, there's allusions to Jesus being king. And so again, that the one of the expectations is that the relationship between God and the king will be as a father and a son. And so, what are some of the other promises that are being made?
I kind of have a question.
Of course, go ahead, Taylor.
Okay, so about like the house of cedar and how the Lord is saying like he's never dwelled in a house.
Mm-hmm.
When he was asking like, why have you not built me a house of cedar? Was that kind of like not mocking him, but kind of like, why haven't you done it yet? Like it wasn't an actual question towards David. It was more, I think it's in verse 7, right around there, like 7b-ish.
Yeah, So this, did I ever speak a word with any of the tribal leaders? And you could kind of, if you cut this part out, why have you not built me a house of cedar? It's asking, it's essentially saying, have I ever asked for a house? And it's a rhetorical question, which the answer is like, no. No, he's given them directions to build a tabernacle, and he's given them directions to build a tent around the tabernacle, but he's never asked necessarily for it. Put me in this one location and keep me there. Until, again, that doesn't happen until they get into Jerusalem. But again, it's part of what is happening there is communicating both that, and I brought up before, but that God being a God of the people and not just specific to a region, but then God also being different from the deities that are around in surrounding nations, and that God doesn't need a specific house in order to be present with the people. And so, again, it's more of a rhetorical question, but the answer being no. And that'll happen a lot in the Old Testament, especially the prophets, where you have these rhetorical questions where the assumption is no. And so, okay, does that make sense? Okay, cool. All right. Any other questions, thoughts, comments? All right. What are some of the other promises that are going on here? Again, you just, if you take a look at the I wills, those will clue you in on what's going on, because this is going to be really, really, really important, especially as we get to we move over to the New Testament. But just even seeing here and why God keeps over and over and over again, despite what's happening with the kings later on, doesn't give up on the people.
He won't take his steadfast love from him like he did Saul.
Good. He's not going to cut off relationship. Which, again, for steadfast love here, let me go ahead and find it. This word here is, let me do this. Which you'll know from your BLE class. So sorry to remind you. If it's traumatizing, I apologize. But steadfast love is rendered in Hebrew. It's rendered a couple different ways. You'll find this as faithfulness, faithful love, sometimes just love, sometimes mercy. But what this is trying to point towards is this word in Hebrew, chesed, which can mean a lot of different things, but it's specifically tied to covenantal love, commitment, or loyalty. But again, the underscore this covenantal part. That there's no real English one, like there's no singular translation that we have for this word. And so we have to use all these different words to try to make it make sense. But again, it's tied to covenant. Of Yahweh not taking his covenantal love, commitment, or devotion or loyalty back to Israel in light of what's happening, especially when the king goes astray and the people likewise go astray. And so again, that becomes really important to remember, especially when we get to later on in the prophets, because it'll come up a lot in Hosea. It'll come up a lot in Isaiah, and it'll definitely come up when in Mary's song when we get to Luke, which we'll talk about her song. I believe it's in Luke 2, of how Yahweh hasn't removed his steadfast love from Israel, despite the appearances of such. All right. So, other promises, or other what are the other things is Yahweh promising from this? Here, let me me do this, make this a little easier. So you can see here what's happening, that I will make your name great. I will appoint a place. I will give rest from all your enemies. I will raise up your offspring after you. I will establish his kingdom. I will establish his throne. I will be a father to him. These aren't necessarily promises as much as are conditions. I will punish him with a rod when he commits iniquity, and I will not take a steadfast love away from him. And so you see what's happening here again. Why have I mentioned on our scripture story assignments, and again to kind of do a little bit of practice, why I mentioned take a look at repeated words or repeated themes of what happens. Because again, these I wills will let you know exactly what are the most important elements of what the author is trying to communicate. And so we see this name being made great for David, which again refers to more prestige or renown, that I will appoint a place. What does this sound like when God will give a place to his people? What other covenant does it sound like? Think back in the story. You can go to the beginning.
Abraham's?
Good job. And so, yeah, it calls back to Abraham, that God's going to give the people a place to dwell. Again, but for here, it's my people Israel, and he will plant them. And I will give you rest from all your enemies. So this isn't necessarily so much tied to Abrahamic covenant. It has more plays on Mosaic covenant, that it will go well with you when you dwell into the land. And you can think of Joshua there, that should they be obedient to covenant obligations, then they would have peace from their enemies. And I will raise up your offspring after you, and I will establish his kingdom. Again, who does that sound like? More so this offspring part. What other covenant does it sound like? Raising up offspring.
Still Abraham.
There you go. Yeah, trick question, because it's still Abraham. Good. So you see how these covenants start building on one another as the story starts developing and the condition and the context starts to change. But one of the things that's tied over in the story is this, in specific regards to descendants, is this idea of God building David a house. And again, that's where the turn starts to happen, is that you see how often the word house is being brought up here. That settled in his house. See, I'm living in a house, but David wants to build God a house. But instead, God turns it around and turns David and says, I'm going to turn you into a house, which what that means is that I am going to make you a dynasty. I'm going to make you a dynasty. You're not going to be a one and done like Saul. Rather, you're going to have descendants one after another. And again, your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever. And so Yahweh is making David both a household, an entire family, but then also a lineage. And so again, this becomes really, really important as Jesus enters onto the scene. But here we at least get the seed of the thought that there's always going to be somebody from David's throne that is on the throne. This is a forever kind of deal. And I can't stress that enough, that this is a forever kind of deal. There is always going to be somebody on the throne from David's house forever. And so keep this in mind, especially as we get talking to exile in a few weeks, that this thing was meant to last forever. Somebody's always going to be on David's throne. Always going to be on David's throne. And so to go back to this, that the Yahweh presses pause on David's idea of David building the house. But instead, David's own son was going to build Yahweh a house. And Davidic covenant can be marked out like this: that David's name is going to be made great. And again, when it said about this, what it means is, let's see if I can get this right. That's something: notoriety, fame, noun. And to provide for his people Israel a place where God will plant them so they're secure. To give them rest from their enemies, to establish David's dynasty again as a household, and to enable David's son to build God's permanent house. So the first two, I'm going to call back to Abrahamic covenant. The last three, they have some Mosaic covenant nuances. Mosaic covenant nuances. All right, are there any questions, comments, concerns thus far? Questions. Nice. Sequoia, what specifically is really cool?
I think just the fact that it's like an eternal covenant, like someone will always be on the throne, like that's eternal. I think that's wild, you know?
Yeah.
Like even back then.
Yeah. And what makes it so wild other than just kind of the eternal aspect of it?
I think just the forethought of it,
Okay.
and also that like so far we've had these covenants that have really like they've gone one step at a time, but this is a covenant that kind of like I don't know starts something so huge. Like each covenant was important, but this one to me just I don't know, it's stunning. It's really cool.
Yeah. Especially, hopefully, you guys start seeing the ways in which the covenants kind of build on one another and how David's covenant adopts elements from both. But then what it also does is that we can't forget that what happens is that the covenants will set the expectations of the people, not just for themselves, but then also what is God going to do? And so, again, this is really important in the development, especially in Israel's imagination and thought. When we get to the Kings and we get to the prophets, which you guys are going to be reading about for next week, both in terms of what are going to be God's obligations to us as his people. Because this thing's supposed to last forever. That God's never going to give up on the dynasty. God's not going to allow us to get the crap kicked out of us. God's never going to kick us out of the land. He's promised it to David, so he has to do it. And so the things that which God is obligated to do, again, in the covenant, sets the expectation for the people. But again, what we're going to start to see is a little bit of a shift in what happens, not just between what Yahweh's being obligated to do, but then also how the people either live up to expectations or fail. Which again, we'll start to see how that happens in the story. So you guys can only imagine what turn it takes given how the trajectory of the story's already gone so far. And so again, and the expectations don't shift when we get to the New Testament. So it's crucially important to keep so much of this in mind, especially when we get there, because otherwise Jesus is going to be at the mercy of our whims and opinions. And so, and again, especially as you read through Luke 2, that you'll start to see a lot of nuance of what's happening there when we get there. So, and so any other thoughts, comments, questions, concerns? All right. Well, one of the things that I do, this is just kind of an aside and just kind of summarizing it, that God makes this promise forever, which extends beyond David and the nationhood of Israel itself. There's going to be this child who comes from David's family, who goes beyond David, lives beyond David, does work beyond David and Israel, and is himself some kind of eternal. That the solution will come in God's anointed as Messiah, the perfect King, who leads his people in adherence to Yahweh's covenant. And I need to, again, underscore this, that leading the people in adherence to Yahweh's covenant, again, that even though the expectations, again, on God's part, start to build, start to grow in terms of the eternality of the thing, that this thing's supposed to last forever, the expectation will persist for the King to lead people in covenant faithfulness. And this is where I need to make this crucial connection, that in leading the people in covenant faithfulness, the people fulfill their vocation, their calling of being reflections in the earth, their initial vocation from Genesis 1 of being made in God's image and likeness. Again, that in leading the people in covenant faithfulness, the people live out, fulfill, walk out, work out, whatever, however you want to put it, their vocation of being a reflection of God in the earth, in both being a priest, a representative of God, and in also being a king or queen and being a representative, being responsible to care for both creation and for one another. And so in leading, again, the king leading the people in their covenant obligations and leading the people in faithfulness, the people fulfill their vocation. People fulfill their vocation in being representatives of God on the earth, kings and priests, queens and priestesses. And so when the king fails to do this, again, the people likewise fail to live into their vocation. And the reason why I repeated it so much isn't just for the sake of repetition. For one, brain science says that we need the repetition because we don't catch things the first time. And the other thing is that this is how we start to stitch the story together from Genesis all the way up to this point, which we're at in 2 Samuel, going into 1 Kings. That to see how what's going on in kingship ties back to what's happening in Genesis, and then later on with Abraham, with Moses, with Judges, and then with Samuel, and then now to the monarchy. That you see God working with this people in order to help them to live into their vocation, which demands redemption. Again, which demands redemption in order to live into their vocation. And so after the Bathsheba incident, David's life will spiral downward. But while David he helps to maintain the covenant obligations of the people to Yahweh, but meanwhile his family life, it falls apart. It falls apart. And so as we get into Kings, David's leadership of the people and covenant faithfulness will become the standard for every king that follows. And again, when you have references to how kings ruled like David, like their father David, and this comparison between kings and their father David, that's what the reference is being made to. That the king's ability to likewise lead like David, namely, whether or not the king leads in helping the people live up to the covenant. But I do need to bring up, and I brought up last class about with David and Bathsheba, that part of the reason David starts to go wrong is because of the same reason what happens to Saul earlier and Solomon later, specifically in regards to how these people wield power. How the leaders wield power has everything to do with whether or not they continue to lead faithfully or whether or not they spiral downward. Again, how power is used dictates whether or not the kings lead faithfully and continue faithfully or spiral downward. You saw it with Saul and how his spiral downward because of his jealousy, his insecurity, his fear led him to go and pursue David and try to kill him. And then he ends up, not only that, he wants to, he refuses to wait for Samuel. So he takes the blessing for himself and then ends up sacrificing it. You see with David, a few chapters before the Bathsheba incident and what he does with Mephibosheth, which is Saul's nephew, that what you see there is how David wields power for good, that he brings in what would be called his enemy and he loves him, takes care of him, provides for him. But what he does with Bathsheba, that David wields power for selfish purposes. That David wields power for selfish purposes and selfish ends. That he sees a woman bathing on the rooftop, which is common for the time period. That it was likely that she was, it was during her menstruation cycle, so she would already be outside the house because that was what was marked out in Torah. That was her covenant obligation. And so likely gauging in a bathing ritual on top of the roof, again, which is very common, because it provides at least some level of privacy, or you'd think. And then David sees her, and it's not certain whether or not it was rape. It's possible. But what David does, again, he sees something, he sees a woman, he wants her, and he takes her. Despite her being married, despite him being married, and then has her husband killed to try to cover it up. Again, selfishly using power for his own purposes. And so again, so when we get to Solomon, Solomon starts off well. Solomon starts off really well, kind of. At least asking for wisdom, and that's about it. That's where we kind of end. Let me move this up a little bit. And Solomon offers 1,000 burnt offerings, considers himself inadequate for kingship, and requests wisdom. That there's a thought in Solomon's mind that he's not fit for this job that he has to do. He's not fit for this job he has to do. So what ends up happening is that he prays for wisdom. God appears to him, asks him what he wants, and then you guys have read through it for today's assignment. And how does God respond in kind? Through Solomon's prayer. How does God respond to Solomon's prayer?
God gives Solomon the wisdom that he asks for, but God also gives him extra things on the side, even though Solomon didn't ask for them. God gave him riches, he gave him long life, and I think peace from his enemies. I'm not sure about that last one, but I know the first two are correct.
Yeah, there is an element of there in peace from enemies. So again, calling back to David, and what Yahweh's providing in terms of the king. Note that it's Yahweh who's providing the peace, despite the people wanting the king to provide the military strength in order to get that. That Yahweh not only grants Solomon's request, but then also goes above and beyond that, again, as a mark of grace towards Solomon. And Solomon goes on to build the temple, again, which you guys had read about for today, that there's cherubim, trees, and flowers invoking idea of Eden, and Yahweh's presence in the temple establishes Zion in the center of the universe. And then something really weird happens in that the cloud fills the temple at its completion. And you guys had read it for today. What does Solomon do to build the temple? Like, how does Solomon get the job done? Because he doesn't just go out there and do it himself. If you guys need to read through it again, you guys can go ahead and read through. Um, let's look at this real quick.
Didn't he use forced labor?
Good. Uses forced labor. Who else uses forced labor? Think back in the story. Who else uses forced labor to build?
Pharaoh.
Arrow?
Good. Good. So you see right after this prayer for wisdom, how Solomon, well, I'll get to it in a little bit, but you start to see how power is already starting to be corrupted. But yet in the middle of it, God still decides to show up. God still decides, again, which should be very odd, because you think that, okay, if you do everything right, then God shows up. But even in the building of the temple, we start to see that there's mixed things going on. And that, again, you'll start to see it decline worse and worse, especially with Solomon's kids. But there's something to power that seems to be going on here. Again, as it continues to further escalate, and again, it'll keep happening, specifically in regards to Solomon. I'll go ahead, that eventually Solomon is not opposed to foreign worship. He's not opposed to idols and Baals. And again, fertility gods. He takes many foreign wives. We see that in 1 Kings chapter 3. The first thing he does, he gets his prayer answered. He gets all this wisdom, gets all this money and fortune God promises to him, and then he goes and he takes a foreign wife. And the big deal with that is, well, what's the big deal with taking a foreign wife? A wife from another nation. If you guys may or may not know, but I just wanted to ask. It still happens occasionally today, but not as often.
Weren't they directed not to marry outside of like themselves?
Yeah, and there's a reason for it. Yeah, and it's not just for like purity of the bloodline, but it was a way that nations would secure peace with another nation. That you could think back to like medieval movies when you have like the King of France marrying off a daughter to a prince of England or something, or somebody from Denmark marrying off their son to somebody from Switzerland. Again, you have these kind of nations that deal with one another in order to maintain peace. You give your kid, or you give, especially if you were the monarch, that you would offer your son or daughter in an arranged marriage in order to secure peace. And that's exactly what Solomon does, is that he makes arrangements with other nations in order to just provide security for himself and for the nation. So again, it's not just plain politics and love stories between people from different countries, but it's a political move. And what happens is that Israel starts to look more and more like Egypt, too much like its neighbors. And so the kingdom is ripped from Solomon's hands. Again, as Solomon starts to spiral out, and then power becomes more and more corrupted. But what is it about power that makes it so corrupting? What is it about power that makes it so corrupting?
With power, I think there's no accountability. Like, if there's no limits placed on that power, then it all goes to your head and you feel that you're invincible and you can do whatever you want with it.
Yeah. There's definitely a lot of danger in power going unchecked. But is it about something about power? Is it something about human? Is this something about the two? Because why are we so resistant to accountability? Even when we have position. Or maybe we don't have position.
I think humans by nature want to be like God, who is sovereign and the ruler, and so more power, I guess, in our minds, our subconscious, make us seem more like Him. And I think that's why power is corrupting, is because we weren't meant as humans to hold that power. We were meant to, be ruled, or we were meant to be under that power.
Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, there's something that seemingly happens, because even stories and movies pick up on this thing. That I really wish I got more into Lord of the Rings, but not enough time to read all the books and not enough time to watch all the movies. But there's, again, you see what happens to, and somebody correct me. Again, this is, what I've learned, at least from what I've read, like the Sparks Notes version of it. Is anybody a serious Lord of the Rings fan? No fear, no shame. Sequoia?
I like it. Lord of the Rings, yeah.
There you go. Tell me about Smeagol
Smeagol.
or Gollum.
So sorry for the spoilers, but he gets greedy and his mate finds a ring. Well, they go fishing like his best mates would.
Mm-hmm.
And then his best mate finds a ring. It's like, it's precious. It's like the one ring that rules them all. And he pretty much kills his friend in order to get this ring. And then he's obsessed with it for his whole life. And he kind of like goes from like a human being to like some creature who lives in a cave, like hiding away from the world.
Yeah. So you start to see how Tolkien, he's taken this imagery of somebody who's a human, and then as they get more greedy, more corrupted by power, how they start becoming something less than human. And so for those, Sequoia, did you have anything else to add?
That was
Yeah.
a pretty good explanation.
There you go. There you go. All right, excellent. Thank you for that, Jake. So you start to see what Tolkien's doing there, with how power starts to wear and tear on the human and what it does to them to make them more and more or less than human. And it seems that as though that's part of what may be happening here, is that there's something about it that left unchecked, it does a lot more harm than good. But is there a way, and of course it just says, is there a way to, is there a way to lead without being, I don't know why I didn't finish. I guess I didn't save it correctly, but is there a way to lead, or is there a way to serve? Is there a way to be in the world in which we're not corrupted by power, in which we're not so influenced that we become more inhumane, or we become more like Pharaoh and less like Yahweh? Okay, so Sequoia, you shook your head? Go ahead.
Yeah, I think by staying close to him, making him the center, it's hard to get like corrupted by power because you're under the right power. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's not about you.
Yeah.
So it shifts the perspective of what's going on. Makes it more.
Mm-hmm. All right, good. Other thoughts? What are the, because whether or not we know it, all of you are in some kind of position of influence, whether in your friend group, whether with siblings, whether with nephews, nieces, family members, that somebody is affected by the decisions that you make. And so how, in what ways can we wield certain influence or certain power that, again, isn't corrupting? And maybe this is a big question at 8:40 in the morning, right before we're about to get out. But this is something that we have to be confronted with in the text, because that, as Sequoia brought up, that there's going to be a demand for not just the king to be under Yahweh's rule, but that the thought is that all the people are under Yahweh's rule and Yahweh's care. And so for us as God's people, that, let me go ahead and we'll get to temple for next week, but I've seen both in and out of church pastors that of hundreds of people, sometimes thousands, pastors of a dozen people. Some have led really well with what they've done with power, and other ones, it was always a fight for power. I was at a small church plant, and there was maybe 20-ish people there, and still between two of the pastors there, couldn't figure out who was top dog. Likely because they were brothers, so that doesn't help at all, and they're very competitive. But that thing just gave it. It was probably about 2 or 3 months after we started noticing some of the cracks at the top between the competition between the two, how they couldn't figure out who was actually running the show. And not that we were looking for anybody to run the show, but you can tell that there was this fight for power. And because of that, 2 or 3 months later, the church dissolved. It's still around now, but again, I think it's maybe at like 10, 12 people at this point. A lot of it family members. One of the brothers who was pastoring there, he took off. He's like, he couldn't be top, and he took off. And so again, that there's something to power and what happens, that it doesn't even take a lot of people to want to make the grab, but before things start falling apart. And again, likewise, seen it in big context too. And so that it doesn't really matter the size in which the opportunity to wield power well presents itself. That at least in my estimation, one of the ways that we can refuse the corruption of it is to give power away. That as followers of Jesus and being reflections of God in the world, we do what God does and we empower other people. That we don't hoard it to ourselves and try to have our own selfish ambitions done, but that with the clear view of the good of the people and with trying to be as obedient as we can to God and being faithful to God, that we choose to give power away and that we don't use it to hoard over people, but that we take the words of a famous first century Jewish rabbi, that we take them seriously, and that those who are going to be the greatest are going to become least. And that who's going to be the ruler is the one who serves. And not that we just become easily manipulated to people's whims and desires, but that the seat that we choose to take is the one near the back. We don't just choose to sit up in the front. And that we seek opportunities to love and to care for people, likewise giving up whatever power we might have. But again, in pursuit that people may be empowered, cared for, and loved, and seeing in what ways there that we are transformed into being made more like Jesus. Because again, Jesus doesn't pick up a sword. He picks up first a towel and being a servant, and then he picks up a cross, and he asks us to do likewise. Which that is a lot of what looks like giving up of power, which looks like taking up a cross. And I'm not just speaking to you guys, but I'm also speaking to myself, because there's times where I want to protect myself. I want to look out for me. I don't want to get up early in the morning to have to take the dog out. And this is just, again, something funny, but I don't want to have to keep putting myself second in order to keep putting people first. And it's not to say not to neglect, but again, it has everything to do with the posture and the heart in which I take. And for all of us, that we still do the stuff for self-care. We still take care of ourselves and making sure we're taking the Sabbath, and we make sure we're still, again, tending to the things that we need to in order to best care for ourselves, while at the same time, again, the postures in which we take will oftentimes dictate more so what we do with power than what it'll do to us. Because trust me, it will do something to us should we ever get into those positions. But we can start now to be able to cultivate, again, to cultivate the humility, to cultivate the giving away of power, of looking to empower other people and to make a place for people. knowing that that's exactly what God does. That God makes a space for us. God makes a space for humans in Genesis. God makes a space for humans in with the monarchy. And he makes a space for us in Jesus, and Jesus inviting us to be followers. Come follow me, and I'll make you fishers. And so again, that being said, that I think one of the best ways you can do it is just by giving it up. And so, are there any thoughts, questions, comments, concerns? I know I went a little bit over after I said we're going to be out early, but hopefully the Partita rant was worth it. All right. Well, if you guys have any questions, comments, concerns, I'll be here. Otherwise, you guys have an absolutely brilliant weekend. I'll be emailing you guys again for next week, talking about extra credit, just again to give you guys a break. That if you're needing that, or if you're needing some extra credit because you missed one of the assignments or something like that, yeah, get your assignments in if you're a little bit behind. Take a few hours this weekend to rest, take a break, give your brain a break, take a nap, drink some water, go for a walk. Watch cat videos, do all those kinds of things. So, all right. Well, if there are no questions, comments, you guys have a great day. Happy Friday to you all. See you guys.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
You're welcome, man.
You.
See you guys.